I opened my apartment door on a cold, rainy night in Akron, finding my grandmother abandoned like unclaimed luggage with an oxygen tank and 2 trash bags. My bank account held less than $50, and my rent was late. My family thought they were dumping a mute burden on their most worthless relative. They were wrong. What changed everything was not money, but the secret she silently kept, waiting for someone kind enough to find it. My name is Tessa Ashford. I am 31 years old, and my life is a precarious tower of minimum wage shifts, unpaid bills, and sheer exhaustion. I live in a cramped ground-floor apartment in Akron, Ohio, where the walls are thin enough to hear the neighbors argue and the cheap floorboards always feel slightly damp against my bare feet. I survive by trading my waking hours for pennies, constantly running on the edge of complete burnout. During the day, I process dense insurance files at Meridian Claims Processing, staring at a flickering monitor until my eyes burn and my vision blurs. At night, I take grueling dispatch shifts at Northline Medical Relay, answering panicked calls from people whose lives are falling apart. I do not have the luxury of sleep, hobbies, or a social life. I have only the brutal necessity of survival, dragging myself from one month to the next. It was a freezing, rainy Monday night when my mother's luxury vehicle pulled up to the cracked curb outside my window. The rain was slicing relentlessly through the pale glow of the streetlights, turning the street into a dark, slick mirror. I was standing in my tiny kitchen, a mug of cheap instant coffee warming my numb hands, trying to summon the physical energy for my impending night shift. The heavy doors of the vehicle slammed open, cutting through the sound of the storm. Out stepped my mother, Renata Ashford, wrapped tightly in a pristine designer trench coat, her immaculate hair perfectly shielded by a wide, expensive umbrella. Next came my golden boy brother, Calder Ashford, whom everyone calls Cal, stepping out carefully to avoid ruining his leather shoes. Right behind him was my uncle, Dwayne Ashford, looking shifty and impatient. They were not alone. They reached into the back seat and roughly pulled my grandmother, Helen Ashford, out into the freezing downpour. She was a frail, fragile shadow of the fierce woman who used to run a bustling roadside motel, now clutching a thin, wet cardigan tightly around her shaking shoulders. Cal hauled a heavy green oxygen tank out of the trunk, letting it clank violently against the wet asphalt. Dwayne followed closely behind with 2 large, black plastic trash bags slung over his shoulder. They did not look like a family dropping in for a warm evening visit. They looked exactly like thieves hastily disposing of heavy evidence in the dead of night. I shoved my door open and stepped out onto the small, sinking concrete porch. The freezing rain instantly soaked right through my thin socks. I stared at the 3 of them, then looked down at my grandmother, who sat shivering uncontrollably in a collapsible transport wheelchair they must have rented or taken from a clinic. "What in the world is going on?" I asked, my voice rising sharply over the loud drumming of the pouring rain. Renata did not even step fully onto the porch to seek shelter. She kept one foot securely on the wet walkway, her body angled away from my home, entirely ready to retreat. "It is just for a few days. Tessa," she said, her tone sharp, cold, and heavily practiced, like a prepared public relations statement. "There is a massive paperwork glitch with her long-term care facility. Just a minor administrative error on their end. They cannot admit her into the private room until sometime next week." "A paperwork glitch?" I repeated in disbelief, staring blankly at the 2 dripping black trash bags. Dwayne unceremoniously dropped right by my welcome mat. "You brought an old sick woman here in the middle of a massive thunderstorm with her belongings in garbage bags." "Do not be overly dramatic," Cal chimed in, leaning casually against the porch railing while keeping his expensive jacket dry. "We are all making major sacrifices right now. Just put her in the corner of your living room. She barely moves around anyway." Grandma Helen had been nearly mute since suffering a massive stroke exactly 7 months prior. Before the stroke, she was incredibly sharp, profoundly stubborn, and the only person in our entire extended family who ever bothered to look at the fine print on a contract. But the brutal stroke took away her strong voice, and the exact moment she lost her ability to speak loudly, My family viciously swooped in. They used her new silence as a blank check. They spoke over her. They made major decisions for her. And now, they were coldly abandoning her. I knelt down on the wet concrete and pulled open the tied top of one of the trash bags. Inside was a chaotic, depressing mess of tangled clothing, twisted plastic nasal cannulas, and a large clear plastic bag stuffed completely full of loose pill bottles. I pulled the heavy bag out and held it up to the dim porch light. The pharmacy labels were an absolute disaster. One large bottle had a handwritten sticky note slapped carelessly over a pharmacy printout. The faded prescription list, folded haphazardly inside, was dated over 4 months ago. The primary health insurance card was a blurry, unreadable black and white photocopy on cheap paper. There were 0 discharge papers, absolutely no emergency contact lists, and missing medical directives. They brought absolutely nothing that a responsible caregiver would actually need to keep a sick woman alive. "There are no clear instructions here," I said, a deep wave of pure panic rising quickly in my tight throat. "Half these plastic bottles have completely wrong names on them. Where are her actual legal documents? Where is the primary care file?" Dwayne looked away quickly, pretending to deeply inspect the rusted gutter above my door. Cal checked his expensive watch with an annoyed sigh. Renata let out a long, exasperated breath, a very specific sound designed perfectly to make me feel incredibly small and stupid. "We are handling the complex legal side of things," Renata said smoothly, her voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "You just need to make absolutely sure she eats a little soup and gets her daily oxygen. Do not make this situation harder than it has to be." I stood up slowly, the cold rain now matting my hair flat against my freezing forehead. I looked straight into my mother's eyes. "Why me? You have a massive 5-bedroom house out in the expensive suburbs. Cal just bought a brand new luxury boat. Dwayne has an entirely empty guest house behind his garage. Why are you dumping her at a tiny, cramped apartment with a girl who constantly works 2 separate jobs just to keep the electricity on? Why did you choose me?" Renata looked at me with a gaze so intensely cold, it actually made the freezing rain feel warm by comparison. "Because you are the most flexible, Tessa," she said slowly, without a single trace of guilt or hesitation. "You do not have a busy husband to consult. You do not have screaming children to worry about. You do not have a heavy mortgage. Your life is vastly easier to simply pivot and manage. You are just completely available." Flexible, available, easy to manage. I knew exactly what she meant. It was the deeply ingrained family code for entirely worthless. I was always the lowest priority, the designated dumping ground for any heavy burden the important members of the Ashford family did not want to carry themselves. At that exact moment, my old cell phone buzzed inside my damp pocket. I pulled it out with wet, trembling fingers. The bright, cracked screen lit up with a harsh text message directly from my landlord. "Final warning. Rent is 14 days past due. If I do not have the full $850 by tomorrow morning, the legal eviction process starts immediately." I stared intensely at the glowing screen. I was not enduring a cute, cinematic version of poverty, where a quirky musical montage and a positive attitude magically save the day. I was experiencing terrifying, real-world poverty. The specific kind of poor where one flat tire or one canceled work shift literally means living out of your broken car. My main bank account held less than $50. I was standing precariously on the absolute edge of a sheer financial cliff, and my own family had just cheerfully handed me a solid iron anchor. "I cannot do this," I whispered out loud, the last bit of fight rapidly draining completely out of my tired bones. "You literally have to," Cal said dismissively, turning his back toward the idling luxury vehicle. "We will call you on Friday afternoon. Let us go." They quickly turned their backs. They did not hug her. They did not lean in to say a kind goodbye. They just walked away rapidly into the storm, leaving their own mother shivering on a crumbling concrete porch in the bitter dark. I looked down deeply at Grandma Helen. She sat completely still in the metal chair. Her wrinkled face was a perfectly stoic mask, but her old hands loudly told the agonizing truth. Her thin, frail fingers were gripping the frayed edge of her wet blanket. She was squeezing the cheap fabric so incredibly hard that her prominent knuckles were entirely paper white. She could not speak a single word, but she heard absolutely everything. She knew exactly what had just transpired. She knew with complete certainty she had been viciously betrayed by the very people she had spent her entire life fiercely protecting. I swallowed my heavy anger, unlocked my front door, and pushed her wheelchair over the threshold into my tiny, poorly lit living room. I dragged the heavy green oxygen tank inside, leaving long, muddy streaks across the cheap, peeling linoleum floor. I locked the front door tightly behind us, the loud metallic sound of the deadbolt echoing sharply in the quiet, damp apartment. "Okay," I muttered softly, speaking mostly to myself to calm my racing heart. "Okay, let us get you dry and warm." I spent the next 2 grueling hours carefully drying her off, changing her into a warm flannel nightgown I found stuffed carelessly at the very bottom of the second trash bag, and plugging the heavy oxygen machine into the wall outlet near my faded love seat. I surrendered my only bed to her. It was the only morally right thing to do. She did not fight my help. She simply watched my every movement with dark, incredibly intense eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Once she was safely settled and breathing evenly to the steady, rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator, I sat down heavily on the hard floor under the dim, flickering light of the kitchen hood. I pulled the 2 wet plastic bags toward my knees. I desperately needed to figure out the medication situation. I needed to understand exactly which medications were supporting her heart condition and which treatment was helping prevent dangerous blood clots. I dug deeply through the depressing piles of mismatched socks, cheap dollar store toiletries, and heavily faded sweaters. I reached my arm deep into the large pocket of an old, heavy wool winter coat, searching blindly for any stray plastic pill bottles. Instead, my cold fingers brushed suddenly against something very stiff and surprisingly smooth. I quickly pulled it out into the light. It was a thick, heavy paper courier envelope. It had been folded over twice and shoved deep into the coat pocket, hidden from casual view. I turned it over slowly in my shaking hands. The official return address was stamped brightly in bold red ink. It was directly from the Summit County Clerk of Courts. I carefully tore the glued seal open and slid the thick stack of documents out onto the kitchen floor. The heavy paper was highly official and densely covered in complex legal jargon, but the large, bold header printed at the very top of the first page was perfectly clear to anyone reading it. It was a formal notice of certification. I scanned rapidly down the page, my tired eyes catching sharply on the bolded text sitting right in the center. It was a legal document confirming monumental rights and access easements related to a massively valuable commercial property. But it was not just any random property. And the extremely lucrative rights did not belong to my mother, or Cal, or Dwayne. The notarized document clearly stated that all final authorization and developmental consent for the valuable land in question remained firmly under the sole, unrevoked name of Helen Ashford. I sat there frozen on the cold kitchen floor, listening to the heavy rain lashing violently against the thin window pane. I looked slowly from the thick legal packet toward the dark bedroom where my grandmother lay completely silent. A horrifying, sickening realization washed entirely over me. My family had not abandoned her here tonight, simply because she was a heavy burden. They had dumped her because they were hiding her from the legal system. They had happily discarded the frail woman, but they were desperately circling the immense, world-changing power she still quietly held in her silent hands. Sitting on the cold linoleum, staring at the heavy county seal stamped on the thick paper, the bitter reality of my entire existence within the Ashford family crystallized with a sickening clarity. I had always been the afterthought. From the moment I was old enough to recognize the shifting dynamics of our household, I understood that I was firmly stationed at the absolute bottom of the priority list. I was the child who received less investment, less patience, and far less of a voice. Whenever the family structure required a compromise, a sacrifice, or a sudden loss of resources, My name was the very first one offered up on the altar. The contrast between my brother and me was carved into stone early on. Cal received expensive private baseball coaching, brand new vehicles the moment he got his license, and a college fund that was fiercely protected. I received hand-me-down winter coats, a bus pass, and constant lectures about the virtues of building character through hard work. The absolute defining moment of this dynamic occurred 9 years ago when my father passed away following a catastrophic industrial accident at a local manufacturing plant. The ground completely gave way beneath our family, but the resulting shockwave only truly leveled my world. At the time, I was merely 2 semesters away from completing a grueling physical therapy assistant program. I was pulling excellent grades and finally building a tangible future. Within 1 week of the funeral, the unspoken expectation became an ironclad mandate. I dropped out of my classes without hesitation to take a miserable full-time job stocking heavy boxes in a windowless warehouse, purely because our household needed immediate liquid income to keep the lights on and the mortgage paid. Cal, however, did not miss a single beat of his comfortable life. He was already drawing up ambitious business plans for his own roofing company. My mother made absolutely certain that he received the vast majority of my father's meager life insurance payout to serve as his initial seed money. "Cal is the one who will take this entire family to the next level," Renata used to declare proudly, pouring him fresh coffee at the kitchen table while I silently laced up my heavy steel-toed boots for another 12-hour manual labor shift. "And you, Tessa, you are so incredibly strong. You are the kind of person who can take the hardship." For a very long time, I absorbed that specific phrase like a desperate, starved sponge, foolishly believing it was a badge of immense honor. I thought she was praising my resilience. It took me over a decade of bone-deep exhaustion to finally realize it was not a compliment in any capacity. It was a calculated hunting license. It was their official, permanent permission slip to exploit my sense of duty until there was nothing left of me but empty fumes. There was only one person in our bloodline who never bought into the myth of Cal the Savior, and that was Grandma Helen. She and my grandfather were built from an entirely different, much stronger kind of steel. Together, they ran the Ashford Motor Court, a sprawling, classic roadside motel situated right on the busy edge of Route 8. It was a massive piece of commercial real estate, featuring flashing neon signs and long rows of meticulously maintained rooms. It represented the very last piece of legitimate, hard-earned wealth our previous generation possessed. When my grandfather passed away 5 years ago, the rest of the family immediately transformed into circling vultures. The county was rapidly expanding, and aggressive commercial developers were constantly sniffing around the prime highway frontage. Renata, Cal, and Dwayne saw nothing but a massive, life-altering pile of cash. They relentlessly pressured Grandma Helen to sell the raw dirt to the highest bidder. They brought her glossy brochures, printed out estimated property values, and constantly cornered her at every holiday gathering. But Grandma Helen was a fortress. She would plant her feet squarely in her beliefs and refuse to be bullied. "Slow down and read the fine print," she would command them, tapping her heavy reading glasses against whatever shiny proposal Cal shoved in front of her face. She was the only person with the authority to authorize a sale, and she absolutely refused to rush into signing away her husband's legacy just so her greedy children could secure a quick, unearned payday. The bubbling tension finally reached a toxic boiling point exactly 7 months ago. My mother hosted a suffocating, highly combative family dinner. The atmosphere in the house was thick enough to choke on. I was deliberately banished to the kitchen to scrub heavy pots and pans, while the adults locked themselves in the formal dining room. Through the thin walls, I could hear the violent arguments regarding durable powers of attorney, asset management, and complex property transfer deeds. I was strictly forbidden from viewing a single page of those legal documents, told firmly by Dwayne that it was high-level business I would not understand. The shouting echoed through the hallways, Dwayne demanding she stop being a roadblock, Cal utilizing his slickest, most aggressive salesman tactics, and Renata weaponizing strategic, guilt-inducing tears. Grandma Helen finally stormed out of the house that night, her posture rigid, her jaw locked in pure, seething defiance. Tragically, just 2 days after that explosive argument, the massive stroke tore through her brain. The absolute second the hospital doctors confirmed that the neurological damage to her speech center was incredibly severe. My family synchronized their watches and began broadcasting a brand new, highly coordinated narrative. Suddenly, to anyone in town who would listen, Grandma Helen was terribly confused. She was slipping into senility. She was dangerously stubborn, prone to irrational outbursts, and entirely disconnected from objective reality. They painted a tragic, highly effective picture of a declining old woman losing her mind, effectively making it perfectly acceptable for them to step in, speak on her behalf, and slowly take total control of her affairs. They made the entire extended family and all her old friends believe she was simply an exhausting, tragic burden. But sitting here now, feeling the heavy, expensive paper of the county documents against my fingertips, I knew their narrative was a profound, calculated lie. I knew this because Grandma Helen had never treated me like a disposable spare part. While my mother was busy blindly worshiping Cal, it was my grandmother who pulled a tall stool up to the front desk of the motor court on quiet Sunday afternoons. She was the one who patiently taught me how to properly balance a heavy ledger using a sharp pencil. She showed me how to calculate overhead costs down to the absolute last cent. Above all else, she drilled a vital rule into my head: never, under any circumstances, sign your name to a piece of paper you have not read multiple times. Looking toward the dark living room where her oxygen machine hummed steadily, a terrifying, earth-shattering realization locked into place. I finally understood the exact predatory nature of their plan. My family did not dump her at my apartment because they trusted my caregiving skills. They definitely did not choose me because they genuinely believed my lack of a husband or children made me a better option. They chose me because they looked directly at my life and saw a weak, utterly defeated, completely powerless target. They saw a desperate woman with less than $50 to her name, actively drowning in late fees, working 2 separate jobs just to barely afford cheap instant coffee and ramen noodles. They firmly believed I was far too poor to ever hire a lawyer, far too exhausted by my double shifts to ask dangerous questions, and far too easily intimidated to ever put up a real fight. They had brought her here tonight to completely isolate her from the outside world, from anyone who might possess the resources or the knowledge to actually advocate for her rights. They fully intended to stash her in my miserable, hidden little ground floor apartment, entirely out of the public eye. They were using my home as a holding cell while they operated in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to execute whatever legal maneuvering they were desperately cooking up to bypass her authority. They assumed that when they finally returned in a few weeks or months to forcefully demand her signature or claim complete guardianship over her estate, I would simply bow my head, step aside, and let them take exactly what they wanted, just like I had done my entire pathetic life. They thought my poverty guaranteed my silence. They thought my exhaustion guaranteed my compliance. But as I carefully slid the county documents back into the heavy envelope and hid it securely beneath the loose floorboard under my kitchen sink, I realized they had made one catastrophic miscalculation. They had handed the most valuable secret in the Ashford family directly to the one person who literally had nothing left to lose. I shoved my heavy, faded love seat aggressively against the peeling floral wallpaper of the far wall, dragging it across the cheap floorboards until it scraped loudly. This desperate maneuver cleared just enough space by the single drafty living room window to lay down a thick, waterproof medical mattress I managed to barter for from a local community board. That rectangular patch of floor instantly became her entire universe. My own bed became the cramped, spring-loaded cushions of the battered love seat. Every single night, my aching spine curled into an unnatural, agonizing arch, while the rhythmic, mechanical wheeze of the green oxygen concentrator filled the tiny room. It sounded exactly like an artificial lung, a constant, heavy, pressurized reminder of the fragile human life now permanently tethered to my apartment floor. My daily existence completely evaporated into a frantic blur of pure, unadulterated survival. I was running a relentless marathon with absolutely no finish line in sight. I worked my grueling 8-hour day shift at Meridian Claims Processing, sitting under harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, staring blindly at complex insurance denial codes until my vision literally blurred. The second the heavy clock struck the end of my shift, I practically sprinted to the corner bus stop. I had a brutally narrow window of exactly 45 minutes between my two jobs. I would burst through my unlocked apartment door, heat up a cheap plastic bowl of chicken broth, spoon it carefully and patiently into her mouth, change her heavy adult sanitary garments, count out her complex array of morning and evening pills, and then sprint right back out into the freezing Ohio wind. My night shift at Northline Medical Relay involved answering desperate, panicked calls from sick people until the sun came up. I functioned solely on perhaps 3 hours of constantly broken, terrible sleep a day. There was absolutely no professional medical help coming through that door. Because my family had conveniently and purposely failed to file the mandatory home care transition paperwork before dumping her. There were no visiting home nurses. There were no weekly wellness checks. I was forced to become a makeshift, terrified nurse entirely overnight. I had to frantically search the internet on my cracked phone to teach myself how to properly read the delicate pressure gauges on the heavy oxygen tanks. I learned the hard way how to gently pinch the incredibly thin, translucent skin on the back of her hand to check for severe, life-threatening dehydration. I memorized the exact, terrifying warning signs of a dropping pulse. Every single hour felt like walking a greased tightrope over a blazing fire with no safety net below. The massive financial cost of keeping her alive began to rapidly drag me underwater. The specialized, high-calorie nutritional shakes, the sterile sanitary wipes, the replacement plastic nasal tubes, and the sheer, overwhelming volume of out-of-pocket prescription medications drained what little crumpled cash I had left in my pockets. Desperate and out of options, I took my heavy, outdated laptop, the very one I had proudly used back in my physical therapy assistant classes, down to a shady pawn shop on the corner of my street. The man behind the thick, bulletproof glass gave me exactly $120 for it. I walked straight out of the shop, directly to the corner pharmacy, and spent $115 of it solely on her crucial blood thinners. I stopped buying fresh groceries entirely for myself. I lived strictly on plain boiled rice and cold tap water, constantly counting the heavy, dull copper pennies rattling at the absolute bottom of my worn leather wallet. But the most profound and unsettling shift during those exhausting, endless weeks was watching her closely. My family had loudly and constantly insisted she was totally gone, just a hollow, empty shell of a human being. They were completely, horrifyingly wrong. She was entirely physically trapped inside her failing body, but she was fiercely, aggressively present. When I propped her up with cheap foam pillows to watch the local evening news broadcasts, her sharp, intelligent eyes tracked the reporters with intense, unbroken focus. She would scoff silently, her chest heaving slightly, at local politicians she clearly despised. She remembered every single detail of my grueling daily schedule, looking toward the door exactly 5 minutes before I usually arrived. Most tellingly, her frail body would go completely rigid, her breathing quickening sharply into an anxious rhythm whenever the postman dropped a heavy stack of envelopes through the brass slot in my front door. Since the severe stroke had viciously stolen her strong voice, we painstakingly built an entirely new, secret language strictly from scratch. We spent long, quiet hours practicing in the dim yellow light of the living room. It started with simple, frustrated gestures and slowly evolved into a highly precise physical code. One sharp, deliberate tap of her knuckles against the wooden armrest of her tray meant wait. 2 quick, solid taps meant absolutely no. 3 slow, rhythmic taps meant she desperately needed a cup of water, but the most important, critical signal was reserved for true emergencies. If she gripped the frayed, worn edge of her fleece blanket and pulled it tightly toward her chest in a long, continuous, straining motion, it meant danger. As I slowly and carefully untangled the chaotic mess of the black garbage bags my mother had left behind, The true, terrifying scope of their control began to breach the surface. I called the major national bank to request a simple replacement debit card for her daily groceries, only to be informed by a cold, robotic customer service representative that her primary mailing address had been legally altered exactly 6 months ago. All of her sensitive financial statements, her pension letters, and her tax documents were being intentionally routed directly to my mother's massive, secure suburban house. Furious and shaking, I dug frantically into the messy stack of photocopied medical files. I found the intake forms. The primary emergency contact, the singular person legally authorized to make life-or-death medical choices if she became unresponsive, had been quietly switched from her longtime trusted family doctor directly to my Uncle Dwayne. Nobody had told me. Nobody had asked her. They had not just physically abandoned an old woman, they had systematically, methodically built a solid, impenetrable brick wall around her entire existence. They were aggressively controlling every single piece of data that flowed in and out of her life. The sickening realization sent a deep, freezing chill straight down my tired spine. They were legally and financially suffocating her on paper long before they physically dumped her on my floor. The absolute breaking point arrived on a bleak, freezing Thursday evening. The sky outside was completely dark, and the wind was howling fiercely against the cheap glass. I was kneeling exhaustedly beside her mattress on the floor, gently adjusting the clear plastic tubing behind her delicate ears, when a violent, incredibly heavy pounding suddenly shook my front door. The thin, hollow wood rattled violently in its flimsy frame, threatening to splinter. "I know you are in there," his deep, furious, aggressive voice boomed through the narrow hallway. It was my landlord. "Your rent is exactly 3 weeks past due. You have exactly 24 hours to produce $850 in cash, or the county sheriff is coming here to physically drag you and your garbage onto the street. Do not test me. Open this door right now." My racing heart slammed painfully against my ribs like a trapped bird. A massive wave of pure, suffocating despair washed entirely over me, threatening to pull me completely under the dark water. I was entirely out of money. I was out of energy. I was entirely out of hope. I shut my burning, exhausted eyes, ready to rest my heavy head on the cheap linoleum floor and let myself pause beneath the crushing, unbearable weight of it all. I simply did not have the strength to keep battling the whole world anymore. But then, I felt a sudden, surprising pressure on my left arm. I opened my eyes slowly. Grandma Helen had reached out with her frail, violently trembling right hand. She stretched her arm across the small gap between us and clamped her cold, bony fingers firmly and tightly around my bare wrist. Her grip was astonishingly, unbelievably strong. Her sharp, dark eyes locked directly onto mine with a fierce, burning, absolutely terrifying intensity. She stared right into my soul, completely ignoring the violent pounding at the door. She raised her index finger slightly, keeping her grip on my arm. 2 solid, heavy taps against my skin. "No, we do not quit. We do not surrender. We do not let them win." I stared back at her, the heavy, suffocating knot of sheer panic in my chest slowly, miraculously loosening. Her silent defiance poured directly from her skin into mine like an electric current. For the very first time in my entire adult life, as the angry landlord's heavy boots finally echoed away down the wooden hall, I realized I was no longer fighting this massive, terrifying war completely alone. The morning after the landlord delivered his terrifying eviction threat, I pulled the heavy county envelope from its secure hiding spot beneath the warped floorboard under my kitchen sink. The harsh morning sun filtered through the dirty, cracked window, illuminating the dense legal jargon I had only briefly skimmed on the night my family abandoned her. I poured my absolute last scoop of cheap coffee grounds into a chipped mug of hot water and sat down at the wobbly laminate table. I desperately needed to understand exactly what I was looking at. The bold, black heading at the top of the thick stack read, "Access Consolidation Petition." I traced my index finger slowly line by line down the dense paragraphs, painstakingly deciphering the formal, complex language. For years, My mother and my uncle had loudly and constantly broadcasted to the entire extended family that the old Ashford Motor Court had been entirely liquidated. They claimed the land was completely sold off to a random commercial developer right after my grandfather died. That was a massive, calculated lie. The physical buildings were long gone, bulldozed into dirt, but the absolute most valuable asset had never been legally surrendered. Grandma Helen still retained a crucial, unyielding legal chokehold on the property in the form of a massive utility easement and the exclusive groundwater rights for the entire commercial tract. A colossal national logistics conglomerate was aggressively attempting to acquire that specific stretch of highway frontage. They needed to build a state-of-the-art dispatch hub and a massive warehouse facility. However, the county zoning board flatly refused to approve their commercial building permits until every single inch of the underlying land rights was legally consolidated and transferred. They needed the final consent decree signed, notarized, and formally filed. Without Grandma Helen's legitimate signature on that exact line, their massive commercial development was completely paralyzed. I turned to the third page with trembling hands, where the preliminary financial terms were explicitly outlined. The proposed compensation and restitution for surrendering those specific access rights was absolutely staggering. It was not just a few $1,000s meant to quiet an old woman. It was an initial buyout offer of exactly $850,000, plus a guaranteed ongoing percentage of the commercial lease revenue. That specific amount of money could effortlessly secure high-quality, 24-hour private nursing care for the rest of her natural life. It could buy a beautiful, small house with a specialized walk-in shower and a garden. It was life-altering wealth, just sitting there in a bureaucratic holding pattern, waiting for a single stroke of a pen. I pushed my chair back rapidly and walked over to the medical mattress where she rested by the drafty window. She was already fully awake, watching my every movement intently. I knelt beside her on the cold linoleum and held the thick document up so she could clearly see the bold print. I read the name of the logistics project and the words Ashford Motor Court out loud. Her physical reaction was instantaneous and utterly terrifying. Her frail body stiffened sharply, as if a high-voltage electrical current had just ripped through her veins. She raised her good hand and slammed her bony knuckles violently against the wooden edge of her feeding tray. 1, 2, 3. The sharp, heavy cracks echoed loudly in the small, quiet room. Then, she reached down with aggressively trembling fingers, grabbed the frayed hem of her cheap fleece blanket, and dragged her hand in a long, continuous, agonizingly slow horizontal line. Danger. It was the ultimate, absolute warning in our newly formed silent language. She was not just mildly agitated. She was explicitly warning me that we were standing directly on top of a highly explosive live landmine. I knew I could not simply wait in the dark for my brother to make his next aggressive move. That very afternoon, I utilized my single 30-minute lunch break from Meridian Claims Processing to sprint 3 entire city blocks in the biting Ohio wind directly to the Summit County Records Building. It was a sterile, imposing concrete structure smelling heavily of industrial floor wax and old paper. I approached a bored-looking clerk sitting behind a thick pane of smudged plexiglass. I slid the notice of certification through the small metal slot and firmly asked to see the complete public file associated with the petition. The clerk typed lazily on a loud mechanical keyboard, her tired eyes scanning a glowing green monitor. She frowned slightly, leaning closer to the screen. "This entire file has a hard freeze hold on it," the clerk stated in a flat, monotone voice. Someone already tried to submit a formal quitclaim deed transferring the easement rights exactly 4 weeks ago. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. "What happened to the transfer?" I asked, gripping the small metal ledge beneath the window to steady my violently shaking hands. "The county registrar officially rejected it on the spot," she replied, scrolling further down the digital record. The reviewing officer flagged the primary signature as entirely inconsistent with the historical notarized records on file. They suspected it was a bad forgery and legally demanded a secondary, in-person notarization directly from the property owner. The applicants immediately withdrew the petition the very next morning. A cold, sharp realization pierced directly through my chest. Who were the applicants? Who exactly filed the paperwork? The clerk squinted at the bright screen, visibly annoyed by my intense line of questioning. A private corporate entity. It says right here. The filing party was Cedar Atlas Holdings, a registered limited liability company. I politely thanked her, stepped away from the plexiglass window, and practically ran to one of the public access terminal computers sitting against the far brick wall of the lobby. My cold fingers flew across the greasy keyboard as I accessed the State Business Registry database. I typed in the exact name of the shell company. The search results loaded agonizingly slowly. Line by line, there it was. Cedar Atlas Holdings was officially registered exactly 2 months after Grandma Helen suffered her devastating stroke. I clicked frantically on the Corporate Officers tab. The registered managing director of the company was Calder Ashford. The secondary registered agent was Dwayne Ashford. I stood completely frozen in the middle of the bright, echoing lobby, my mind racing with absolute, terrifying clarity. The entire twisted puzzle finally snapped into a perfectly horrifying picture. My family had never abandoned Grandma Helen because she was too difficult or too expensive to manage. They did not drop her at my door simply because they were tired. They abandoned her because they had already been caught attempting to legally forge her signature by the county government. They knew with absolute certainty that if they kept her in a legitimate, state-regulated long-term care facility, there would be strict, unbreakable oversight. There would be professional nurses, doctors, and vigilant social workers constantly monitoring her visitors and assessing her legal capacities. They would never be able to sneak a shady, paid-off notary into a busy hospital room to forcefully extract a signature from a vulnerable stroke victim. They desperately needed her entirely off the public grid. They needed her isolated, hidden, and completely separated from anyone who might actually advocate for her legal rights. They dumped her in my miserable, invisible ground-floor apartment because they fully believed I was far too ignorant and far too exhausted to ever look into her legal affairs. They purposefully placed her here as a temporary holding measure. They were simply buying crucial time, aggressively working through their shady shell company to find a highly corrupt notary or figure out a foolproof way to bypass the county registrar entirely. And the exact second they secured a clear path to that massive corporate payout, they would descend on my apartment, demand her total compliance, and discard us both without a single second thought. I walked slowly out of the heavy glass doors of the records building and into the freezing afternoon air. For the very first time in my entire adult life, the suffocating, heavy cloak of permanent victimhood began to lift from my shoulders, rapidly replaced by a cold, hardened, impenetrable armor. I was no longer just the pathetic, broke granddaughter struggling desperately to keep a sick old woman alive in a tiny apartment. I was the absolute center of gravity in a massive fraud scheme. My mother, my brother, and my uncle had spent my entire existence treating me like a weak, disposable pawn, completely blind to the fact that their arrogance had just unknowingly handed me the ultimate keys to their kingdom. They were more than willing to trample each other, to break federal laws, and to sacrifice the very life of their own mother just to get their hands on this money. But to get it, they absolutely had to go through me first. From this specific moment forward, I was the sole gatekeeper to the exact prize they lusted after, and I finally understood the rules of the terrifying game they were playing. Exactly 48 hours after my visit to the county records building, a sharp, rhythmic knocking echoed through my tiny apartment. I was sitting on my battered love seat, carefully spooning warm oatmeal into Grandma Helen's mouth. I set the plastic bowl down on her tray, wiped her chin with a clean cloth, and walked cautiously toward the entryway. I did not need to look through the scratched peephole to know who was standing on the other side. The air in the hallway felt suddenly dense, charged with a predatory energy. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the cheap wooden door open. My mother, my brother, and my uncle stood shoulder to shoulder on my worn welcome mat. The sheer audacity of their presentation nearly knocked the breath out of my lungs. Renata was clutching a massive, brightly wrapped bouquet of expensive lilies, the cloying, sweet floral scent instantly overpowering the faint smell of rubbing alcohol and old linoleum that usually filled my home. Cal was holding a heavy brown paper grocery bag, the tops of several premium canned soups visibly poking out. Dwayne stood slightly behind them, attempting to arrange his naturally shifty features into a mask of deep, paternal concern. "Hello, sweetie," Renata purred, her voice dripping with an artificial, sugary warmth that made my stomach churn. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, her sharp heels clicking loudly against the floorboards. "We know it has been a terribly difficult couple of weeks. We brought some supplies." Cal and Dwayne followed her inside, instantly making my cramped living room feel suffocatingly small. They completely ignored me and crowded around the medical mattress by the drafty window. "Look at you, Grandma," Cal said loudly, employing that specific, condescending tone people use when speaking to a toddler or a very slow dog. "You look so much better. The rest really did you some good." Grandma Helen did not blink. She stared perfectly straight ahead, her jaw locked tight, her hands resting flat and rigidly against the top of her fleece blanket. "Tessa, we need to have a very serious, adult conversation," Renata announced, pivoting gracefully to face me. She set the massive bouquet of lilies down directly on top of the small wooden table I used for sorting medications. The vibrant yellow petals looked grotesquely out of place next to the sterile plastic pill organizers. "We have been doing a lot of deep thinking, and we have come to a very difficult realization. This arrangement is simply not sustainable. This apartment is far too small. The air circulation is terrible. The floor is an absolute tripping hazard. You are the ones who literally dumped her on this floor," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously low and completely steady. Renata sighed, a sharp, theatrical sound of profound maternal disappointment. "We made a temporary emergency decision during a highly stressful transition period. But looking at the reality of the situation now, it is clear we made a mistake trusting you with this level of responsibility. We found a premier, high-end rehabilitation center exactly 2 counties away. They have round-the-clock nursing. They have a beautiful physical therapy garden. It is exactly what she needs." She took a slow step toward me, her perfectly manicured hands clasping together in front of her expensive cashmere sweater. She lowered her voice, shifting effortlessly from fake sweetness to calculated, surgical cruelty. "Let us be entirely honest with each other. Tessa," Renata said, her eyes scanning my faded uniform shirt and the dark, exhausted circles beneath my eyes. "Look at how you are living. You are drowning. You are working 2 miserable, dead-end jobs just to barely scrape by. Your landlord has been calling Cal, complaining that you are severely behind on your rent again. Your schedule is completely chaotic. You do not have the financial stability, the proper medical training, or the basic life skills to handle an invalid. It is frankly a little selfish of you to try and keep her here in this depressing squalor when we are offering a beautiful, professional alternative." She wielded my poverty like a sharpened butcher knife, expertly slicing right through my insecurities. A few days ago, that exact speech would have completely shattered me. It would have made me cry. It would have made me surrender. But today, wrapped tightly in the heavy, invisible armor of the truth I had discovered at the county records office, her cruel words simply bounced off me. "A professional alternative," I repeated flatly. "And how exactly do you plan to legally move her? She cannot verbally consent to a transfer, and her medical file explicitly states she has not surrendered her own medical autonomy." Cal stepped smoothly forward, reaching inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, meticulously folded stack of heavy legal paper and placed it right next to the flowers. "That is exactly why we brought this," Cal said, flashing a bright, practiced salesman smile. "It is a standard petition for emergency guardianship. It is just a simple, professional solution to cut through the bureaucratic red tape. It temporarily grants Mom and me the legal authority to sign the facility admission papers on her behalf. We just need Grandma to hold the pen and make a simple mark acknowledging she understands the transition. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the table and looked down at the documents. The bold heading was clearly visible. It was not just a medical transfer form, it was a comprehensive, sweeping conservatorship agreement. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense, single-spaced paragraphs, immediately locating the exact clauses I knew would be there. Buried deep within the medical authorizations were incredibly broad provisions granting the conservators absolute total control over all real estate assets, commercial easements, and pending property negotiations. "This transfers total control of her estate," I said, looking up to meet Cal's gaze. "This has absolutely nothing to do with a rehabilitation center." Dwayne shifted uncomfortably on his feet, nervously rubbing the back of his thick neck. "Look, we do not have time to sit here and argue over complex legal semantics," he snapped impatiently, his loud voice breaking the carefully constructed facade of politeness. "The developer needs this finalized. We absolutely cannot afford to miss the zoning board hearing next month. If we do not have the designated signatory rights locked down by then, the entire commercial deal completely falls apart, and we lose everything." The room went completely, terrifyingly silent. Cal shot Dwayne a look of pure, unadulterated, murderous rage. Dwayne had just accidentally handed me the exact timeline. They were not worried about her health. They were completely panicked about a ticking corporate clock. Cal quickly tried to recover, his face flushing a dark, angry red. "Dwayne is just stressed about family finances," Cal lied smoothly, picking up a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from his pocket. He uncapped it and stepped aggressively toward the medical mattress. "Grandma, I need you to hold this pen. Just make a single mark on the bottom line. It will get you out of this awful, freezing apartment today." He leaned over her, forcefully pressing the golden pen against her tightly clenched fingers. He reached for the stack of legal papers, preparing to slide them onto her lap. Grandma Helen did not cower. She did not retreat into the pillows. She gathered every single ounce of physical strength remaining in her shattered neurological system. Her left arm, the one the stroke had spared, shot out with astonishing, violent speed. She slammed her open palm directly into the side of the heavy floral vase. The glass shattered explosively against the cheap linoleum, sending dirty water and crushed yellow lilies flying across the room. Without pausing for even a fraction of a second, her hand swept aggressively across the table, catching the thick stack of guardianship papers and launching them violently into the air. The crisp white pages rained down everywhere, scattering into the puddle of broken glass and dirty flower water. Cal jumped backward, swearing loudly, furiously brushing water off his expensive trousers. Dwayne froze entirely in shock. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy, broken only by the steady mechanical breathing of the oxygen machine and the sound of water dripping slowly onto the floor. Grandma Helen glared directly at Cal, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a fierce, absolute, untamable hatred. It was a completely wordless action, but it was the loudest, most definitive rejection imaginable. Renata dropped the act entirely. The fake, sugary warmth completely vanished from her face, replaced instantly by a cold, calculating malice that chilled me straight to the bone. She stepped directly into my personal space, her sharp perfume overwhelming my senses. "You think you are being incredibly clever, Tessa," Renata hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "You think you can play games with us. But you need to understand exactly how this looks to the real world. If you force us to drag this into a formal probate court, a judge is going to look at the undeniable facts. They are going to see a deeply impoverished, desperate young woman severely drowning in debt, suddenly refusing to let her wealthy family provide professional medical care for a severely disabled elder. They will pull your bank records. They will see the eviction notices. The judge will instantly conclude that you are financially exploiting a vulnerable senior citizen to pay your rent." She leaned in closer, her eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "We will completely destroy you in that courtroom. We will have you arrested for elder abuse. You have exactly 2 days to convince her to sign that wet paper on the floor. If she does not, we will return with the county sheriff and a court order. Renata turned sharply on her heel, her shoes crunching loudly over the broken glass. Cal grabbed Dwayne by the arm, and the three of them marched out of the apartment, slamming the door so hard the entire wall shook. I stood completely frozen in the center of the ruined room, my heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. The sheer weight of my mother's threat was suffocating. She was entirely right about the optics. The legal system was practically designed to believe wealthy, well-dressed people overexhausted, broke women living in cheap ground-floor apartments. A soft, frantic rustling sound broke through my spiraling panic. I looked down. Grandma Helen was completely ignoring the mess of water and paper on the floor. Instead, she was frantically, urgently picking at the thick, frayed seam running along the very bottom edge of her old fleece blanket. She caught my eye and pointed sharply at the fabric. Tap, tap, tap. I fell to my knees beside her mattress, pulled a small pair of medical scissors from my pocket, and carefully snipped the heavy threads she was gesturing toward. I reached 2 fingers deep into the dark, hidden lining of the blanket. My fingers brushed against something hard and wrapped tightly in stiff paper. I pulled it out into the dim light. It was a tiny brass padlock key, carefully and meticulously wrapped in a small square of translucent wax paper. Written across the wax paper in Grandma Helen's sharp, distinctive handwriting, clearly penned long before the stroke had taken her mobility, were exactly 6 words: Locker 214, Union Terminal. I stared at the tiny brass key resting in the palm of my shaking hand, the cold metal biting into my skin. The narrative had just shifted beneath my feet. I was no longer just standing in my living room bracing for my family's next brutal attack. Grandma Helen had not just been hiding from them. She had been preparing for a fight, and she had just handed me the first real piece of evidence. My hands were still shaking violently from my mother's vicious threat when I picked up my cheap cell phone. I knew with absolute certainty I could not fight a massive legal battle with $0 in my checking account and absolutely no understanding of probate law. I searched online for free legal aid and found an emergency hotline for the Lakeview Senior Advocacy Project. I dialed the number, praying desperately that someone would answer the line. After several agonizing minutes on hold, a gruff, exhausted voice picked up. It was an investigator named Jonah Pike. I quickly poured out the chaotic events of the past few weeks, but I could hear the heavy, familiar skepticism in his deep voice. He sighed loudly over the receiver, explaining patiently that messy inheritance disputes between angry siblings were incredibly common. He warned me that without hard, undeniable proof of physical abuse, state agencies rarely intervened in family guardianship petitions. "Please," I begged, my voice cracking under the crushing pressure. "Just come see her. Just look at her for 5 minutes before you say no." Reluctantly, Jonah agreed to stop by my apartment on his way home for the evening. He arrived exactly 1 hour later, a tall, imposing man wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a battered leather briefcase. He stood in the center of my cramped living room, looking down at the medical mattress. He started asking standard, dry bureaucratic questions, clearly ready to dismiss us and walk right back out the door. Grandma Helen did not tolerate his dismissive attitude for a single second. She locked her fierce, burning eyes directly onto his face. She grabbed the frayed edge of her fleece blanket and dragged her hand across it in a long, urgent motion. She then pointed her trembling finger directly at the tiny brass key wrapped in wax paper sitting on the small wooden table. She hit the wood with her knuckles, 3 sharp, deafening cracks. The raw, desperate panic radiating from her frail body was so palpable and intense it completely shifted the heavy energy in the room. Jonah stopped talking mid-sentence. He stared down at her, then looked closely at the key. He recognized the undeniable look of a trapped victim desperately trying to signal a hidden lifeline. "All right," Jonah murmured, his professional skepticism vanishing entirely into the cold air. "Where exactly does that key belong?" "Union Terminal," I answered immediately. "Locker 214. Jonah did not hesitate. He told me to grab my winter coat. We drove his unmarked sedan through the dark, freezing streets of the city toward the old, decaying bus depot located on the industrial east side. Union Terminal was a massive, echoing cavern of stained concrete, flickering fluorescent lights, and the heavy, lingering smell of diesel exhaust. It was a place entirely forgotten by time, making it the absolute perfect location for hiding things that were never meant to be found by the outside world. We walked briskly past long rows of empty plastic chairs and finally found the rusted bank of metal storage lockers tucked away in a dark, damp corridor near the abandoned ticket counters. I found locker 214. My breath caught sharply in my throat as I slid the tiny brass key into the rusted horizontal slot. It turned with a sharp, heavy metallic click. I pulled the thick metal door open. Inside sat a pristine, heavy-duty fireproof lockbox. Jonah carefully lifted it out by the handle and set it securely on a nearby wooden bench. The box itself was not locked. I popped the heavy metal latches and pushed the lid back. The distinct smell of old paper and dust hit the cold air. The box was packed incredibly tight. There were thick, tightly bound copies of the original roadside motel financial ledgers, thick stacks of bank statements, and several heavy manila envelopes sealed tightly with red notary wax. Lying right on top of the paper mountains was a sleek silver USB drive. My hands shook uncontrollably as I opened the first heavy envelope. It contained a pristine, highly official legal document. I read the bold heading printed at the top. It was a formal, irrevocable revocation of power of attorney. I checked the date stamped clearly at the bottom of the page. It was signed, formally witnessed, and officially filed exactly 4 weeks before her devastating stroke. My family had been loudly parading around town claiming they had the ultimate legal authority to manage her life. But this single piece of paper proved she had officially and entirely stripped my mother, my brother, and my uncle of every single ounce of representative power they ever possessed. "Look at this," I whispered, handing the heavy paper to Jonah. His eyes widened significantly as he read the legally binding text. "If they are actively trying to force a guardianship petition now, and they know this document exists," Jonah said, his voice tight with sudden adrenaline, "they are committing massive coordinated fraud." Jonah pulled a sleek digital tablet from his leather briefcase. "Plug the drive in," he instructed. Holding the screen toward me, I pushed the silver USB directly into the side port of his device. A single video file popped up on the bright screen. I tapped play. The screen flickered, and suddenly, Grandma Helen was staring right back at us. It was incredibly jarring to see her sitting completely upright in her old kitchen, wearing a crisp blouse, her face full of vibrant color and sharp intelligence. Her voice, strong and completely unwavering, filled the quiet, echoing corridor of the empty bus terminal. "My name is Helen Ashford," she said, looking straight into the camera. "I am recording this as a formal, undeniable declaration of sound mind. I am making this record because my children, specifically Calder and Dwayne, are aggressively conspiring against me. They have secretly formed a shell company to artificially depress the true value of my highway property. They intend to forcefully coerce me to surrender my access rights for a fraction of their true worth, so they can pocket a massive corporate payout behind my back." I felt the warm blood drain entirely from my face. She knew everything. She had known every single detail of their disgusting, greedy plot long before her brain betrayed her physical body. On the screen, she leaned closer to the camera, her dark eyes burning with the exact same fierce intensity I saw every single day in my miserable apartment. "I have officially revoked their authority. I have locked away the true deeds, but I know my family. I know their bottomless greed. If they cannot force me to sign, they will find a way to turn my silence into a signature." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The video ended, fading instantly to a stark black screen. She had perfectly predicted her own tragic imprisonment. We dug deeper into the fireproof box. It was a meticulously organized treasure trove of devastating criminal evidence. I found a thick blue folder packed tightly with printed bank transfers proving my mother had been systematically draining my grandmother's monthly pension directly into a private offshore account. There were forged medical receipts illegally billing the state for expensive at-home nursing visits that had literally never happened. There were even copies of the fraudulent change of address forms they deliberately used to legally blindfold her from the outside world. They had built a massive, towering house of cards using stolen money and forged ink, and I was holding the heavy iron sledgehammer right in my lap. At the very bottom of the box, beneath the heavy financial ledgers, I found a crisp white business card. The name printed in sharp black letters was May Donnelly, senior partner at a highly respected downtown law firm. Her name appeared repeatedly across several of the notarized envelopes we had just opened. "We need to call her immediately," Jonah said, pulling his cell phone from his coat pocket. I dialed the number printed on the card. Despite the late hour, an answering service connected me directly to May's personal line. I explained exactly who I was and what I was currently holding in my hands inside a freezing bus terminal. "Thank God," May exhaled loudly through the phone speaker, the profound, genuine relief highly evident in her voice. "Helen came to me months ago, terrified her children were going to chemically restrain her or declare her legally incompetent to steal the property rights. We prepared all of those documents as a nuclear contingency plan. When she suffered the stroke and your mother suddenly barred me from visiting the hospital room, I knew they had trapped her, but I could not legally intervene without a family member acting as a direct petitioner. I needed someone on the inside to find the box. My brother just left my apartment with a blank conservatorship petition," I told her, my voice hardening into solid steel. "They threatened to come back in 2 days with the county sheriff to force her to sign it or have me arrested for elder abuse." "They will not get the chance," May replied sharply, the fierce, aggressive tone of a seasoned trial lawyer instantly taking over the conversation. "I am filing an emergency ex parte injunction the moment the courthouse opens tomorrow morning. I will block that guardianship petition and freeze every asset connected to their names. Keep her safe tonight. Tessa." "We start first thing in the morning." I ended the call and looked down at the fireproof box resting on the wooden bench. The heavy, oppressive weight of the past few weeks suddenly evaporated, replaced entirely by a surging, powerful wave of absolute clarity. My family had looked directly at my grandmother's silent, broken body and seen a helpless, pathetic obstacle they could easily step right over. They had looked at my entirely empty bank account and seen a weak, easily manipulated pawn. They were so blinded by their own towering arrogance that they never realized the absolute truth. Grandma Helen was never completely helpless. She had masterfully orchestrated this entire brilliant counterattack right from a thin mattress on my floor. She had meticulously laid the massive trap, secured the devastating evidence, and then silently waited for the exact right person to come along, the one single person in the entire Ashford bloodline who would open the door, face the crushing pressure, and absolutely refuse to betray her. The exact moment May Donnelly filed the emergency ex parte injunction at the county courthouse the following morning, I foolishly believed I could finally take a deep breath. I thought having a seasoned legal professional actively fighting on our behalf would create a protective shield around my tiny apartment. I was completely wrong. When my family realized their quiet, secret path to the massive commercial payout had been suddenly blocked by a lawyer, their retaliation was incredibly fast, thoroughly coordinated, and shockingly dirty. They did not retreat. They immediately sought to cut off every single source of oxygen I had left. The devastating counterattack began exactly 24 hours later. I dragged myself into the bleak, windowless office of Meridian Claims Processing for my morning shift, desperately needing the meager hourly wage to buy more medical supplies. Before I could even log into my terminal, my floor supervisor tapped my shoulder and escorted me directly into the Human Resources Department. A grim-faced manager informed me that an anonymous tip had been formally submitted to the corporate compliance hotline overnight. The caller explicitly accused me of illegally accessing highly sensitive client medical files for personal financial gain. "We are placing you on an immediate, unpaid administrative suspension pending a full internal investigation," the manager stated coldly, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk. I stared at the termination warning, my stomach dropping violently to the floor. I knew exactly who made that anonymous call. Someone in my family was deliberately severing my primary financial lifeline, ensuring I would starve before I could ever reach a courtroom. I was stripped of my badge and escorted out of the building by a security guard in less than 15 minutes. The suffocating pressure only intensified when I took the long bus ride back to my neighborhood. I walked heavily up the cracked concrete path toward my unit and froze. Taped securely to the center of my front door was a glaringly bright yellow notice from the property management company. It was not just another standard late rent warning. Someone had formally complained to the city housing authority, claiming I was operating an unlicensed, highly dangerous elderly care facility in a residential zone. The paper cited multiple alleged fire code violations and threatened an immediate, forced eviction within exactly 72 hours. They were systematically trapping me in a burning room. Inside the apartment, my cheap cell phone vibrated endlessly against the kitchen counter. Cal had completely dropped his polished, polite brother routine. He was relentlessly deploying psychological warfare directly through my screen. His text messages swung wildly between two extreme personas. 1 hour. He would play the deeply wounded sibling, writing, "I am so incredibly sorry this misunderstanding is tearing our family apart. Please just talk to me so we can fix this." 2 hours later, the mask would completely slip, and the underlying venom would bleed through the screen. "You do not have the money to fight this battle to the end. You cannot afford to play this game. You are going to permanently ruin your own life over absolute stubbornness." While Cal hammered my phone, Renata was aggressively poisoning the well with our extended relatives. My phone rang constantly with calls from angry aunts and confused cousins. My mother had spent the entire morning crying to anyone who would listen, spinning a masterful, twisted narrative. She told them I was cruelly isolating Grandma Helen because I had secretly discovered a minor land settlement and was holding her hostage to steal the money for my own massive debts. In a matter of hours, Renata had successfully transformed me from the exhausted, desperate caregiver into a greedy, manipulative villain in the eyes of my entire bloodline. I felt completely surrounded, backed entirely into a dark corner with no remaining exits. But May Donnelly was a veteran of vicious probate wars, and she struck back with a brilliant, highly specialized countermeasure. That afternoon, a licensed, independent cognitive evaluator hired by May arrived at my apartment. She was a serious woman with a thick clipboard who did not care about family gossip or money. She spent 2 intensive hours sitting directly on the floor next to Grandma Helen. The evaluator meticulously documented our physical tapping system. She asked complex, specific questions requiring nuanced answers, carefully observing the deliberate, consistent responses. Before leaving, the specialist looked me right in the eye and handed me a signed affidavit. Her speech center is severely damaged, but her cognitive processing remains entirely intact, she confirmed firmly. She is highly capable of expressing stable, legally binding choices through nonverbal communication. I am certifying her as fully competent to reject any forced guardianship. It was a massive, impenetrable shield against their primary legal argument. But the relief was instantly shattered the very next morning by a horrifying discovery. The medical supply company finally sent a field technician to inspect the heavy green oxygen concentrator. I asked him about the missing intake paperwork from the night my family abandoned her. The technician pulled up her digital file on his company tablet, frowning deeply at the screen. "This is incredibly strange," he muttered, turning the screen toward me. "Look at this specific entry date." I leaned in and read the bold text. Exactly 2 weeks after her devastating stroke, while she was still lying in a vulnerable state in the hospital recovery ward, someone had submitted a newly signed medical directive. They had completely altered her primary emergency contact from her personal doctor to my Uncle Dwayne, but far worse, they had actively submitted a revised "do not resuscitate" order. I stared closely at the digital scan of the document. The signature at the bottom was a blurry, frantic, entirely illegible scribble that looked absolutely nothing like her real handwriting. A cold, sickening horror washed over my entire body. They had not just stolen her money and isolated her. By forging that specific medical document, they had legally authorized the medical staff to simply let her die if her heart faltered, ensuring she would never wake up to expose their massive property fraud. I grabbed my phone and called May, my voice shaking with pure, unadulterated rage as I explained what the technician had just uncovered. May went completely silent on the other end of the line for several long seconds. When she finally spoke, her tone was stripped of any standard lawyerly detachment. It was cold, sharp, and deadly serious. "Listen to me very carefully. Tessa," May stated clearly. "From this exact moment forward, we are no longer dealing with a simple property dispute or a messy family argument over a commercial easement. This is a massive, coordinated criminal enterprise. We are looking at severe elder exploitation, gross financial fraud, and the deliberate criminal forgery of life-altering medical records." I hung up the phone and looked across the cramped, dimly lit room. Grandma Helen was watching me, her dark eyes completely steady, waiting for my reaction to the crushing pressure. My family fully expected me to simply crumble. They expected the job loss, the eviction threat, and the vicious family rumors to completely break my spirit. They thought I would call them begging for a small financial handout in exchange for my total surrender. Instead of curling into a defensive ball, a strange, profound calm suddenly settled directly over my racing heart. I was entirely done absorbing their relentless blows. If they wanted to play a dirty, high-stakes game of manipulation and hidden agendas, I was finally ready to participate. I sat down at my cheap kitchen table, opened my text messages, and stared at the last threatening message Cal had sent me. I was not going to argue with him. I was going to use his own towering, blinding arrogance directly against him. I was going to get my golden boy brother to say the exact terrible things he thought no one would ever be smart enough to record. I typed out a highly calculated reply, carefully dripping with fake exhaustion, profound desperation, and total defeat. I told him I was completely broke, terrified of the looming eviction, and finally ready to discuss a private arrangement. I hit send. I set the phone down on the table and waited. I was no longer just the pathetic victim being endlessly hunted. I was actively learning how to set a lethal trap using nothing but paper, precise timing, and cold patience. It was exactly the kind of ruthless intelligence my family had spent 31 years convincing themselves I did not possess. The flickering neon sign of the rusty highway diner buzzed against the dark, freezing sky. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth, keeping my hands shoved deep inside the pockets of my heavy winter coat. My right thumb pressed firmly against the screen of my cheap cell phone, feeling the distinct haptic vibration that confirmed the audio recording application was actively running. I kept my eyes focused on the scratched wooden table, 4 booths away, sitting completely unnoticed behind a massive laminated menu. May Donnelly casually sipped a cup of black coffee. She looked like just another weary traveler taking a break from the interstate, but she was closely monitoring every single breath I took. The heavy glass door swung open, and Cal walked in. He immediately dropped his usual arrogant swagger, replacing it with the heavy, slumped posture of a deeply exhausted and heartbroken older brother. He slid into the booth across from me, running his hands over his face as if the weight of the entire world was resting squarely on his expensive shoulders. He ordered a black coffee from the passing waitress, waiting until she walked away before leaning intimately across the table. "I am so incredibly sorry about how things escalated at your apartment," Cal said softly, his voice thick with highly practiced remorse. "Mom is just terrified, and Dwayne is losing his mind with stress. I never wanted it to get this ugly between us. You have to believe me. I hate seeing you suffer like this. I know about the eviction notice. I know about the job suspension. You are completely drowning." I forced my shoulders to drop, purposely projecting the exact image of a completely broken, defeated woman he expected to see. I stared blankly at my empty hands. Cal took my silence as a total surrender. "We can make all of this agonizing pain stop today," he continued, his tone shifting into a smooth, comforting rhythm. "I will personally pay your landlord every single cent of your back rent. I will cover your utilities for the next 12 months. On top of that, I will hand you exactly $15,000 in cash tomorrow morning to get you back on your feet. All you have to do is sign the transitional guardianship papers. Let us move her to the private facility where she will be safe, and you can finally get your life back." I took a slow, deep breath, perfectly playing the part of the desperate sibling ready to grab the lifeline. "I just do not understand why this has to happen right this exact second. Cal," I whispered, letting my voice crack slightly, "why are you and Uncle Dwayne rushing this so aggressively? Why threaten me with the sheriff?" Cal glanced nervously over his shoulder, completely failing to notice May quietly tapping her own phone screen a few tables away. He leaned even closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Because Dwayne made a massive, incredibly stupid mistake," Cal confessed, slipping entirely out of his polished mask. He already accepted a massive, 7-figure advance payment directly from the commercial logistics developers months ago. We desperately needed that capital to keep my roofing business afloat. The developer assumed we already had her legal consent. If we do not secure her legitimate, court-approved signature to formally legalize the property transfer by the end of this month, the developers are going to sue us for massive corporate fraud. They will throw us in federal prison. We just need to legitimize the paperwork to save the entire family." The cold, the heavy recording safely secured in my pocket felt like a loaded weapon. Within exactly 2 hours of leaving that diner, May was sitting at her polished mahogany desk, aggressively pulling financial threads using the exact name of the logistics company Cal had foolishly dropped. By late afternoon, she had struck absolute gold, using the recording as leverage to pry open closed doors. May legally traced a massive wire transfer from the developer directly into Cedar Atlas Holdings. From there, the dirty money was shamelessly funneled straight into Cal's private roofing company, officially logged under the laughable disguise of generic consulting fees. It was a completely arrogant, shockingly sloppy money laundering trail. Their overwhelming greed had made them incredibly stupid. Armed with this devastating paper trail, May ruthlessly cornered the lead corporate compliance officer for the National Logistics Project. The executive was entirely horrified to discover his massive development was deeply entangled in a vicious elder exploitation scandal. Facing the sheer terror of a massive public relations disaster and criminal conspiracy charges, the executive immediately flipped. He agreed to formally cooperate with our side, explicitly confirming he would testify under oath exactly which Ashford family members had aggressively demanded the illegal advance money to pave the way for the highway project. While May was systematically dismantling their corporate shield, the carefully constructed facade of my family began to violently fracture from the inside. That same evening, a soft, hesitant knock sounded at my apartment door. I opened it to find my mother standing alone in the dark hallway. Renata looked entirely unrecognizable. Her expensive makeup was heavily smeared, and her hands were trembling violently. She walked into my living room and collapsed into my cheap kitchen chair, weeping with a raw, agonizing sincerity I had never witnessed in my entire life. "I did not know about the medical records," Renata sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I swear to you, I did not know. I knew Cal and Dwayne were aggressively skimming her monthly pension to pay off my underwater mortgage. I looked the other way because we were absolutely drowning in debt, but I just found out what Dwayne did to her hospital intake forms, forging the do not resuscitate order, planning to let her die if she stopped breathing. I never wanted her dead. I just wanted the money to save the house. They have gone completely insane." It was a profound, deeply pathetic emotional fracture, proving the war was no longer two-sided. The villains were violently turning on each other. Through all of this escalating chaos, Grandma Helen was quietly preparing her own ammunition. May had discreetly smuggled a specialized speech therapist into my apartment. For 2 grueling hours every single afternoon, I sat in the corner and watched my grandmother wage a brutal war against her own damaged brain. She fought through agonizing frustration, forcing her vocal cords to form sharp, broken, but highly distinct words. Yet, whenever the phone rang or Renata was in the room crying, Grandma Helen maintained her absolute, terrifying silence. She flatly refused to give them even the slightest hint of her returning strength, silently keeping her final bullet chambered for the exact right moment. The night before the monumental probate hearing, a brutal reminder of my agonizing reality arrived in the mail. I pulled a glaringly bright red envelope from my box. It was a final disconnection notice from the utility company. If I did not pay the massive overdue balance within exactly 48 hours, they were going to entirely cut the electricity to my apartment. I stared at the heavy green oxygen machine humming steadily by the window. Without power, she would slowly suffocate. They had successfully orchestrated a scenario where I could technically win the legal war tomorrow, but still entirely lose her life the very next day, because I was simply too poor to keep the lights on. Right as the heavy weight of the electric bill threatened to crush my lungs, my phone rang loudly. It was May, and her normally confident voice was tight with severe stress. "We have a massive, potentially catastrophic problem," May stated bluntly. "Your Uncle Dwayne just filed a highly detailed, sworn legal affidavit with the court exactly 20 minutes ago. He managed to find a corrupt, retired physician who signed a statement declaring your grandmother was suffering from severe, advanced dementia a full year before the stroke ever happened. If the judge accepts that medical affidavit tomorrow morning, it automatically invalidates her original power of attorney revocation. It means every piece of evidence we found in that locker is legally void. If we do not completely shatter that specific lie in front of the judge tomorrow, we are looking at a multi-year legal war, and they will physically take her away from you before the sun sets." The heavy oak doors of the Summit County Probate Annex felt exactly like the towering gates of a medieval fortress. Inside, the harsh fluorescent lights highlighted the stark, brutal divide between our two warring factions. On the right side of the center aisle sat the Ashford family, presenting a flawless, highly calculated tableau of responsible, upper-middle-class concern. Cal wore a meticulously tailored charcoal suit that undoubtedly cost more than I earned in 3 full months of double shifts. Renata sat perfectly upright, her hair immaculately styled, dabbing her completely dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. Dwayne wore a stiff navy blazer, trying his absolute hardest to project the reliable image of a concerned family patriarch. On the left side of the room, I sat at a scratched wooden table next to May Donnelly. I had scrubbed my face and carefully ironed my only presentable work blouse, but absolutely no amount of hot water could wash away the deep, purple bruised circles under my eyes or the visible, bone-deep exhaustion vibrating through my spine. Beside me, Grandma Helen sat motionless in her rented transport wheelchair, her thin hands resting flat on her lap, staring straight ahead at the elevated bench. The family's high-priced probate attorney, a slick man with a booming, highly theatrical voice, opened their offensive precisely as May had warned. He approached the bench and dramatically submitted a towering stack of crisp documents. First came Dwayne's devastating trump card, the sworn legal affidavit from the corrupt retired physician, officially claiming Grandma Helen was suffering from severe advanced dementia a full 12 months before her stroke ever occurred. Then, Cal confidently handed over pristine admission packets for the Luxury Rehabilitation Center, complete with forged consent forms that heavily implied I had previously agreed to the transfer before selfishly and irrationally changing my mind. The slick attorney pivoted sharply on his expensive leather shoes, pointing a polished finger directly at me. "Your Honor, we are looking at a deeply tragic situation where a desperate, financially unstable young woman is holding a vulnerable elder hostage," he proclaimed loudly to the cavernous room. He then painted a masterful, thoroughly humiliating portrait of my daily life. He read my past due rent notices aloud into the public record. He listed the meager hourly wages of my 2 dead-end jobs. He even brought up the imminent threat of my electricity being entirely shut off within exactly 48 hours. "She is drowning in thousands of dollars of personal debt. She does not have the time, the financial resources, or the objective clarity to provide adequate medical care. She is completely blinded by poverty. She is simply using her sick grandmother as a human shield to negotiate a massive payout from a family land settlement." I felt the entire courtroom staring directly at my frayed cuffs, silently judging my empty bank account. But May Donnelly rose from her chair with the lethal, quiet grace of an apex predator. She did not yell. She did not perform for the gallery. She simply dismantled their pristine narrative with hard, undeniable paper. May submitted my meticulously detailed daily care logs, highlighting every single hour I spent tracking oxygen levels, cleaning feeding tubes, and administering crushed medications in the middle of the night. She submitted the official home assessment report, verifying the sterile condition of her medical mattress. The opposition speaks loudly of responsible care. May addressed the judge, her voice slicing cleanly through the heavy air. Yet the very people demanding absolute guardianship today have not spent a single day, not one solitary hour, actually caring for this woman. They dropped her on a freezing concrete porch in cheap plastic trash bags and completely abandoned her. Then, May called our surprise witness. The lead compliance officer from the National Logistics Project walked through the heavy double doors, looking entirely displeased to be dragged into a messy public court battle. Under May's sharp, relentless questioning, the corporate executive confirmed the damning truth under the strict penalty of perjury. Calder Ashford initiated direct contact with our commercial acquisitions department, the executive stated flatly into the microphone. He explicitly requested a massive, seven-figure advance payment to, quote, resolve the final reluctant signatory on the highway parcel. A loud collective gasp rippled rapidly through the small public gallery. Cal's face instantly drained of all color, his arrogant, relaxed posture collapsing completely as the judge stared down at him with newfound, intense judicial scrutiny. May immediately pressed her massive advantage, bringing the independent cognitive specialist to the witness stand. The specialist explained our secret physical tapping system with absolute clinical precision. She testified that despite the severe physical limitations of the stroke, Grandma Helen retained total cognitive comprehension. The ward is highly capable of making consistent, independent choices through nonverbal gestures, the specialist affirmed strongly. She explicitly communicated her strong objection to being moved from her granddaughter's apartment. She understands the complex nature of her assets. She is not a passive vessel being led by anyone in this room. Despite the heavy, devastating blows May landed, the atmosphere in the courtroom remained dangerously suffocating. The judge, an older, highly cautious man, leaned back in his leather chair, peering over his reading glasses at the massive piles of contradictory paper. He was visibly hesitating. The slick opposing lawyer immediately seized on the judge's hesitation, hammering entirely on the fraudulent medical affidavit Duane had submitted. Even if she can tap her fingers today, Your Honor, we have a sworn medical declaration that her severe mental decline began a full year prior to her medical emergency, that explicitly and legally clouds any past revocations of power of attorney she supposedly signed. Without verbal confirmation directly from the ward, we request an immediate, temporary conservatorship to place her in a neutral, professional medical facility until a full state medical board can properly evaluate her. The judge sighed heavily, bringing his hands together on the desk. I could see the devastating conservative calculation forming clearly in his eyes. He was going to grant a continuance. He was going to let them take her today, locking her safely behind the closed, secured doors of a private facility where my family could control her visitors and we could never reach her again. The system was about to default to the people with the most money. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. I reached under the wooden table and gripped Grandma Helen's incredibly cold hand. Just as the judge opened his mouth to issue the crushing temporary order, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, echoing crack. A tall woman wearing a sharp gray suit and carrying a thick leather binder strode purposefully down the center aisle, completely ignoring the armed bailiff who stepped forward to block her path. She flashed a shiny silver badge directly at the elevated bench. Your Honor, my profound apologies for the sudden interruption. I am a senior investigator with the State Department of Financial Fraud. She unclipped a thick stack of highly official papers from her binder and dropped them loudly onto the opposing counsel's table. right in front of a heavily sweating Dwayne. I am serving an immediate emergency subpoena for all banking, insurance, and state medical reimbursement records connected to Calder, Dwayne, and Renata Ashford. We have officially opened an active criminal probe into the mass fabrication of state-funded at-home nursing claims and the illegal diversion of federal pension funds. The entire courtroom descended instantly into absolute, stunned paralysis. The slick, expensive lawyer physically stepped away from his own clients as if they had suddenly caught a highly contagious, deadly disease. Renata sank much lower into her wooden chair, her perfectly styled head dropping completely into her violently trembling hands. Dwayne gripped the edge of the table, his face a sickly pale green, looking like he was about to vomit right on the polished courtroom floor. Everyone in the room intimately understood that the entire Ashford family facade was rapidly and violently collapsing into total dust. The carefully built walls of their massive conspiracy were aggressively caving in from every single direction. The judge slowly lowered his pen, staring at the state investigator in complete shock. But the absolute heaviest, most terrifying tension in the room did not come from the state investigator, the angry judge, or the panicked lawyer. It came directly from the rented wheelchair beside me. Grandma Helen sat perfectly upright, her chin raised proudly, her dark eyes locked intensely on her 3 terrified, broken children. She remained completely, absolutely silent, sitting in the absolute center of the legal wreckage like an unexploded bomb, quietly waiting for the right moment to detonate. May Donnelly recognized the exact moment the tide permanently turned. She did not give the opposing counsel a single second to recover from the state investigator's devastating entrance. Moving with deliberate, lethal calm, May approached the elevated wooden bench and formally requested permission to present digital evidence that directly contradicted the fraudulent medical affidavit Dwayne had just submitted. The judge, his face now an unreadable mask of cold fury directed squarely at my family, nodded sharply. May opened her sleek laptop, plugged in the silver drive we had pulled from the hidden fireproof box, and turned the bright screen toward the center of the silent courtroom. The video began to play. The crisp, clear image of Grandma Helen sitting upright in her old kitchen filled the monitors. Her voice, strong and entirely unwavering, echoed through the cavernous space. The court watched in absolute horrified silence as the woman they had just been told was severely demented clearly and rationally articulated the exact date, her full legal name, and her undeniable state of mind. She looked directly into the camera lens and explicitly declared she was officially revoking every single ounce of representative power from Renata, Calder, and Dwayne. But the video did not stop there. Grandma Helen masterfully laid out the exact blueprints of their criminal conspiracy. She calmly detailed the creation of their shady middleman company and their aggressive scheme to artificially depress the value of her highway property to pocket the massive difference. Then came the chilling, prophetic warning that made the court reporter physically gasp. If they cannot force me to sign, the digital version of my grandmother stated coldly, they will find a way to weaponize my failing health and turn my silence into a forged signature. Before the slick defense attorney could even attempt to object, I stood up and submitted the digital audio file from my phone. The judge clicked play. The unmistakable sound of Cal's voice from the diner a few nights prior filled the room. Everyone heard him adopting that fake, sympathetic tone, promising to pay off my debts and hand me $15,000 in cash if I just surrendered. Worse, they heard his panicked, entirely unforced confession. They heard him explicitly admit that Uncle Dwayne had illegally accepted a massive, 7-figure advance payment from the commercial developers long before they ever secured the legal rights to the land. The state investigator then stepped forward, opening her thick leather binder. She methodically outlined the preliminary financial audit her department had conducted overnight. She listed the exact amounts of money systematically siphoned from my grandmother's federal pension directly into my mother's underwater mortgage account. She documented the blatantly falsified invoices for at-home nursing care that had never actually occurred. Finally, She presented the most horrifying piece of paper in the entire room, the illegally altered hospital intake form containing the forged "Do Not Resuscitate" order. The atmosphere in the room violently shifted. This was no longer a messy, emotional civil dispute over a stubborn family matriarch. It was a massive, documented criminal enterprise. Cal completely lost whatever shred of sanity he had left. He leaped out of his heavy wooden chair. His face flushed a dark, violent purple. He pointed a shaking finger at the monitors and then directly at the rented wheelchair. "This is a setup," Cal screamed, completely ignoring his own lawyer desperately pulling on his suit jacket. "That video is old. It proves absolutely nothing about today. Look at her. She is entirely gone. She is a completely empty shell. She does not even know what city she is in." The entire courtroom froze. Next to me, Grandma Helen took a slow, deep, rattling breath. She placed her frail, shaking hands firmly on the plastic armrests of her wheelchair. Her knuckles turned stark white from the massive physical effort. Slowly, agonizingly, she pushed her shoulders back and lifted her torso, forcing herself to sit perfectly, rigidly upright. She turned her head, locking her dark, burning eyes directly onto her golden boy grandson. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely unrecognizable. It was a harsh, broken, gravelly rasp, heavily damaged by months of severe neurological trauma and total disuse. It sounded like stones grinding together. But in the absolute dead silence of that massive courtroom, every single syllable hit the air with the devastating force of a sledgehammer. "You dumped me outside her door because I refused to sign." Those 13 words shattered the world. The sheer, undeniable clarity of her statement, combined with the devastating weight of the video and the notarized documents, instantly annihilated the last remaining pillars of my family's defense. The opposing lawyer slowly closed his leather briefcase, entirely refusing to make eye contact with the judge. He knew the war was over. The judge did not waste any time with pleasantries. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down, his voice echoing with absolute finality. He immediately and entirely dismissed the family's petition for guardianship. He officially voided every single pending property transfer and easement petition associated with Cedar Atlas Holdings. He then looked directly at me and formally appointed me as the sole, permanent emergency legal guardian for Helen Ashford, granting me total, unquestioned authority over her medical and financial well-being. But May Donnelly was not finished. She was determined to burn their greedy empire entirely to the ground. She reached into her legal briefcase and pulled out the final document from the old, notarized envelope. "Your Honor, for the official record, I am submitting the contingency clause drafted by my client long before her illness," May announced proudly. "It is an explicit bad actor provision. It legally dictates that if any direct descendant is found to have committed coercion, financial fraud, or medical manipulation to exploit her estate, their status as a beneficiary is permanently and irrevocably zeroed out." May turned to look directly at my mother. "Renata, Calder, and Dwayne Ashford are officially disinherited. Furthermore, the massive commercial buyout from the logistics developer will not go to any private company. 100% of the land compensation will be transferred directly into the newly established Helen Care Trust, managed solely by Tessa Ashford, to ensure the lifetime care of the property owner." There was no dramatic screaming from my family. There were no theatrical, melodramatic tears. The brutal, heavy reality of the law simply crushed them. Cal and Dwayne stood completely paralyzed, fully realizing their business assets were about to be frozen and they were facing severe multi-year federal investigations for fraud and forgery. Renata did not yell or curse my name. She simply slumped forward in her heavy wooden chair, staring blankly at the polished floor in total, absolute silence. For the first time in her privileged life, she was forced to face real consequences, stripped of her usual excuse that we were just a complicated family. I did not become a flashy, arrogant millionaire buying luxury cars or massive estates. That was never the goal. The very first thing I did when the trust funds cleared was march into my property manager's office and pay every single cent of my back rent, effectively ending my lease on the spot. I quit both of my miserable, soul-crushing jobs on the exact same day. I used the trust money exactly as it was intended. I bought a beautiful, modest, single-story duplex on the quiet, tree-lined outskirts of the city. It had wide doors, a large walk-in medical shower, and a beautiful wooden front porch. I hired a team of incredible, highly professional private nurses to help me manage her daily care, finally allowing me to sleep through the night. A few months later, on a warm, golden Tuesday afternoon, the heavy storm of the past year felt like a distant nightmare. I was sitting on our new front porch, carefully planting a row of bright green tomato seedlings in a large wooden planter box. Grandma Helen was sitting next to me in her brand-new, custom-fitted motorized wheelchair, enjoying the gentle breeze. The rhythmic hum of her portable oxygen machine was barely noticeable over the sound of the singing birds. I finished patting the dark soil around the last small plant and sat back on my heels, wiping the dirt from my hands. I looked up and caught her watching me. The fierce, terrifying intensity that used to burn in her eyes during our days in that miserable apartment was completely gone. It was replaced by a deep, profound peace. She reached out with her strong hand and gently covered my dirty fingers. She took a slow, easy breath, no longer fighting the air. She looked directly into my eyes and spoke the very first complete, unbroken sentence she had meant exclusively for me. "You were the only one who opened the door and truly let me in." Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, let me know in the comments where you are listening from. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel and like the video.